Welcome back, everyone. This is the Oracle Decodes Adam and Eve, Memorial Day, and 9/11. And that might sound a little strange to you at first, wondering how the stories of Adam and Eve, Memorial Day, and 9/11 tie together, but I can guarantee you that you will see these connections in a way that you never have before, and we're going to tie them together in this video piece, and you'll see how they indeed make sense as they go together, at least with the help of our all-seeing eye or the real oracle or our secret decoder ring to help us decode things here. So as we do that, we're going to cue up a screenshot in Stellarium to start with, and we're going to do it from the Northern Hemisphere viewer's perspective. And remember, we're going to orient everybody quickly here. The very special place in the sky that we're going to look at is going to be the crossing point of the green line that runs vertically, that north-south meridian line. So we're looking due south, and that line helps orient us to that direction. And then the red arc of the ecliptic that you can see going across the image is where everything, as far as the known zodiac constellations, the sun, the moon, and all the known planets, all rise in the east and set in the west as they travel in the southern sky, right? That's why we look to the south. They all travel along this arc of the ecliptic. So this is why all the action, right, goes on in this very special place in the sky in most of these ancient stories and even these modern day stories. And that's why we are orienting our viewpoint in Stellarium to take a look specifically at this time, which is going to be what we commonly celebrate as New Year's Eve. The reason is because when I read through the book of Genesis beginning in chapter 2, I recognized a familiar pattern, and you will too. It is the beginning of the way to keep a calendar. And in this case, because it's in the book of Genesis, or the beginning of the Bible, it's obviously the first. So we queued things up to a screenshot from the Northern Hemisphere viewer's perspective from New Year's Eve at midnight, and that's where we're going to start reading chapter 2 of the book of Genesis and the story specifically of Adam and Eve. And the reason I've skipped over the first chapter of the book of Genesis is, if you're familiar with this story or the Bible at all, you know that the first chapter of Genesis is where we're given the information about God creating the heavens and the earth in 6 days. And in that version of creation, we're also given the information that Adam and Eve were created by God at the same time. So Adam and Eve were created together. And many people have noticed that there's these two different stories of Adam and Eve in the Bible, from chapter 1 of Genesis and then a different one in chapter 2. But we're going to find out when we decode this story overall that Adam and Eve are still representative. They're still the same characters in the sky story. And so we're going to start with chapter 2 and read from there and then plug things in so that we can completely decode this in a way that will make perfect sense. All right, so as we begin, remember, I'm going to read from the King James Version of the Bible, the public domain version. So some of the language gets archaic, but we'll be fine. And these are pretty well-known stories, so you're going to get the gist of it anyway, right? All right, let's start out here with chapter 2. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all of the host of them. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. These are the generations of the heavens and of the earth, when they were created in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, and every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew. For the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. But there went up a mist from the earth, and watered the whole face of the ground. And the Lord God formed a man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put man who he had formed. So that's the first difference, right, in this telling of the Genesis tale and the creation of Adam and Eve, because it tells us here that in this version, Adam was created first. So let's plug in what we're already given here about Eden. So we're going to plug that in as this whole area underneath the arc of the ecliptic to the Earth's horizon and where it crosses the north-south meridian line. So that very special place, the all-seeing eye or the oracle, is actually the Garden of Eden in this story of Adam and Eve here. And let's go on. From Eden, right, where Adam was put, and out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. All right, so let's plug in these two trees because they are one and the same. The tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life is the special crossing point of the north-south meridian line and the arc of the ecliptic. That special crossing point is the specific story character, right, of the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. Remember, this is dualism or coupling or twinning, mirror imaging that you find throughout. Because remember, we've looked in several pieces at this point that we're looking from the Northern Hemisphere viewer's perspective, right? And it's midnight. But you got to consider that on the other end or the other side of this all-seeing eye or this oracle or this wheel, it's turning where it's daytime in what we commonly call the Southern Hemisphere. So it's noon there where it's midnight here. So that's why there's this coupling or mirror imagery that's seen over and over again. It's referencing this dual tree symbolism that we're given here in the book of Genesis story. So it goes on, and I'm going to skip over these next several verses that talk about these four rivers. You can read them for yourself, and you're going to find a lot of locations that reference, once again, actual places that you can find on Earth. But remember, in previous pieces, we've also learned that in many of these stories, actual places on Earth are coupled or twinned, right, with the reality in the sky above our heads. So these four rivers in this telling are actually referencing these four cardinal crossing points, these very special crossing points in this area of the sky. So that would be where everything rises up from the eastern horizon on the arc of the ecliptic. That's the first. The second crossing point, or the second river, would be the crossing point of the north-south meridian line in the arc of the ecliptic. That's the second. The third would be where everything sets, right, into the western horizon of the Earth from the arc of the ecliptic down into the underworld, in other words. And the fourth would be on the other side of the world, right? From our perspective in the north, it would be in the southern hemisphere, the same cross of the north-south meridian line in the arc of the ecliptic. That, in that location, would be the fourth river. So let's go on. And the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, Of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. All right, so that's the famous, right, part of the story that everybody is pretty much aware of. God tells Adam, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you do, you will die. So let's keep going on with the story before we plug any more elements into the sky story here. From the book of Genesis, it goes on, and the Lord God said, It's not good that the man should be alone. I'll make him a helpmeet for him. And out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field, every fowl of the air, and brought them unto Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. And Adam gave names to all cattle, the fowl of the air, and every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found a helpmeet for him. So I want you to notice right away that Adam is given the responsibility of being the namer of everything, every living creature, right? He's the name giver. Keep that in mind. And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs, and closed up the flesh instead thereof. And the rib, which the Lord God had taken from man, made he a woman, and brought her unto the man. And Adam said, This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Now that's interesting, right? Because Adam, after naming all the different creatures on earth, is then presented by God with this creature taken from he himself. And because Adam is the name giver of all the creatures, he's the one who calls her woman. That's interesting, right? All right, goes on. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. Now let's plug in who Adam and Eve are now, before we go any further. Take a look at what's crowning that very special place in the Garden of Eden, at the location of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and you'll find the constellation of Gemini, the twins. This is where you'll find your characters of Adam and Eve. So Adam and Eve are Gemini in the sky story, and if you just look at how the constellation of Gemini is shaped, you can see how it wouldn't just be our modern mind, right, that might interpret how this constellation was formed this way and try to tell a story about it, that God made what appear to be twins that are even conjoined, maybe at the area of the rib. All of these things start making sense when all you have to do is look at the reality, in this case, of the constellation of Gemini in the sky at midnight on New Year's Eve. So the constellation of Gemini in the Garden of Eden, located specifically at the location of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is the north-south meridian and cross of the arc of the ecliptic, we read on because, of course, we're going to be introduced to a very famous character next. Chapter 3. Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made, and he said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God had said, Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. Now this is interesting because I'm pointing out some other things here before we go forward. This story has been, in my humble opinion, deeply misinterpreted a bunch of times, but intentionally. And these kinds of misinterpretations become insidiously dangerous as to how they actually play out in our reality with one another. Because in trying to explain that this is a story about human nature or original sin, many people are just, even in the text, in the story that we're given, are reading over some very fundamental things that are being missed. Like what we were just given as far as information in these last few verses. The serpent comes up to Eve and asks her this question, and in her answer, isn't she just repeating hearsay? Because remember, she was not yet created when God came to Adam and gave him the warning about not eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? So the only place that Eve could have heard such a warning would have not come directly from God then. It would have come from Adam. But she doesn't say that when she's here talking to the serpent. She just tells the serpent what it is she heard Adam say. So let's go on. And the serpent said unto the woman, Ye shall not surely die. For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. And the eyes of them were both opened, and they knew they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. All right, so let's plug in our famous character, the serpent or the snake. Now that we've gotten to this point of the story, take a look at what's rising up, this very large snake-like constellation from the eastern horizon of the earth on what we commonly celebrate as New Year's Eve. You will see Hydra, the serpent. And when you just take a look at where Hydra's head or the snake's head is in reference to the location of the constellation of Gemini or Adam and Eve, you can see how the snake slithered up to Eve to tempt her with the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And what is that? Take a look at the star Sirius. We've seen in previous pieces this specific alignment before. The fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil is the star Sirius, when specifically on New Year's Eve, that 24-hour period from New Year's Eve to New Year's Day at midnight, you will find the star Sirius, the dog star, the very bright star found in the constellation of Canis Major, or the Great Dog. Sirius is smack in the middle of the north-south meridian line. And remember, this is where the ball drop tradition in New York City comes from, because it's only for this 24-hour period that Sirius is found in this alignment. And after that, Sirius, or the ball, drops. And that's why this tradition is celebrated on New Year's Eve, and why the star Sirius, in alignment with the north-south meridian line on New Year's Eve, is set to mark the genesis, or the beginning, of the next year. So, the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, God warns Adam first, and then he tells Eve that if they eat of it, which they now have done, tempted by the serpent, they will surely die. All right, so let's go forward in the sky story and in the book of Genesis and find out what happens next. So when we queue up a screenshot in Stellarium to what we commonly call March 1st of 2020 at midnight, note the location of Gemini. Now it's off the cross of the north-south meridian line in the arc of the ecliptic, right? So off from the location of eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, Adam and Eve are found now to be about halfway descended into the western horizon of the earth, because as the year progresses a little bit further, that's where you're going to find their journey continuing, right? So let's move on in the story from the book of Genesis. And they heard the voice of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God amongst the trees of the garden. And the Lord God called unto Adam and said unto him, Where art thou? And he said, I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, and I hid myself. And he said, Who told thee that thou wast naked? Hast thou eaten of the tree whereof I commanded thee that thou shouldest not eat? And the man said, The woman who thou gavest to be with me, she gave me of the tree, and I did eat. So this is a famous verse, right, where Adam just throws Eve right under the bus right away, right? Goes on. And the Lord God said unto the woman, What is that thou hast done? And the woman said, The serpent beguiled me, and I did eat. So again, pointing out that, if this is supposed to be interpreted to be just a story about human nature and original sin, and this is just how we all are, and this is why, notice a couple of things. One, that Eve, in her explanation to God in this story, did not say to God what Adam did about her, right? She didn't throw him under the bus and say, well, I didn't hear it even from you yourself. I heard it from Adam. He's the one that told me not to eat of the fruit. And the serpent lied to me. So she left all of Adam and God out of that completely and put it on the serpent and said, the serpent beguiled me. That's why I did it. But also keep in mind that in this innocent state of Adam and Eve, how would they have been aware of deception in the first place? to be on the lookout for it and not to fall for it when the serpent slithered up to tempt Eve, right? All right, keep all that in mind. The reason I'm bringing these things up is because, once again, many of these intense or easy to remember things about these stories are used because they're meant to be mnemonic tricks, not as a way to try to tell us about ourselves as far as our human nature and why we got that way. In some respects, yes, but you can see that more often they're used specifically for the mnemonic device that they were created to be, which is to make these stories easier to remember in a time, at least in our time as people, prior to us having writing. All we had was our memory and these stories to pass on to one another about ways to keep a calendar, like this one is. All right, so it goes on. And the Lord God said unto the serpent, because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle, and above every beast of the field. Upon thy belly shalt thou go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life. And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Now, this is pretty angry and wrathful, vengeful kind of stuff, right? First mistake these innocent Adam and Eve make, and they're cast out of the Garden of Eden, and all of these curses are put upon them for this one mistake, right? And it goes on. Unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. And unto Adam he said, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree which I commanded thee, saying, thou shalt not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also thistles shall bring it forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground, for out of it was thou taken. For dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. And Adam called his wife's name Eve, because she was the mother of all living. Now, another interesting thing to note is this last verse. Adam being the name giver, or the one responsible for nomenclature, first calls his helpmeet woman, and then gives her the proper noun name, Eve, at this point. So now, the constellation of Gemini, just note one more time, the location, halfway, right, from the arc of the north-south meridian line, or the arc of the ecliptic and the north-south meridian line cross, and halfway to the point of descent all the way into the western horizon. So, have already eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The warning from God was, ye shall surely die after you did that, right? So let's go forward a little bit further, no coincidence, to a date commonly celebrated this year as Memorial Day, to the date commonly called May 25th of 2020 at midnight. And what you're going to notice when you're tracking the constellation of Gemini, or Adam and Eve's location this time of year, I highlighted the star, one of the head stars, Pollux, in the constellation of Gemini. Castor and Pollux are the two head stars of the twins, or the constellation of Gemini. And on Memorial Day, this year happens to be the last night at midnight that the heads of the twins, or the constellation of Gemini, will be visible above the western horizon at midnight. After this point, the constellation of Gemini, or Adam and Eve, will be fully descended into the western horizon of the earth, or Adam and Eve will have died, or been entombed, cast out of the Garden of Eden, cast down into earth, or, like I said, have died, put in their grave. And what is put atop a grave? A headstone, right? a memorial. In other words, this is the real reason why the holy day of Memorial Day is actually celebrated. It is because Adam and Eve, from the book of Genesis, from the very beginning, are being memorialized on this day. So let's read on from the book of Genesis. Unto Adam also and his wife did the Lord God make coats of skin and clothe them. And the Lord God said, Behold, the man is become one of us to know good and evil. And now lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from whence he was taken. Now that makes sense when you're looking at the sky story here on what we commonly celebrate as Memorial Day, right? Sent him forth from the Garden of Eden, cast him out of the garden, or out of the area of the all-seeing eye, the real oracle, right? The Garden of Eden, now to the ground from whence he was taken, did the Lord God put Adam and Eve. And it ends with this verse. So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims, and a flaming sword which turned every way, to keep the way of the tree of life. So, as Adam and Eve are the constellation of Gemini, on Memorial Day, after this day actually, are going to be found fully descended into the Earth's horizon. What is this east of the Garden of Eden cherubims set there with a flaming sword turning every way to keep the way of the tree of life? Well, remember, we already decoded that the cross of the north-south meridian line and the arc of the ecliptic are both the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, from which Adam and Eve already ate from and have now died. And it is also the tree of life. So the location that it's coupled with, right, would be referencing the tree of life being in the southern hemisphere, or where it's noon this time of year. And what will you find near the tree of life, or the crossing point of the north-south meridian line and the arc of the ecliptic in the southern hemisphere? Well, the flaming sword which turns every way, of course, the sun. The question to ask now as we end this piece and tie Memorial Day to the Adam and Eve story and now to 9/11 is, well, if the constellation of Gemini is no longer to be found above the Earth's horizon in the west after Memorial Day, when does it come back? When do the twins, or Gemini, or Adam and Eve, return back to the northern hemisphere viewer's perspective above the eastern horizon of the Earth once again? Well, we're looking at a screenshot in Stellarium you can see of the date commonly called September 11th of 2020 at midnight, and note the location of the constellation of Gemini over still descended below the eastern horizon of the Earth. Gemini representing the Twin Towers in this story, and the reason why year after year it is memorialized, because this event happened on the East Coast of the United States, right, in New York, and what was destroyed that day were the Twin Towers at Ground Zero. Gemini, on this day at midnight, if we go forward just one more day to what we commonly call September 12th of 2020 at midnight, you can see that it is only then that the first couple of stars of Gemini will be found to be visible once again from the northern hemisphere viewer's perspective. Looked at from this perspective, from the sky story's perspective, you can now see how indeed the story of Adam and Eve, we were given from the beginning, the book of Genesis of the Bible, Memorial Day, and 9/11 tie together, and why events like 9/11 specifically are memorialized year after year after year. Because for that event, it was the constellation of Gemini that was being referenced, and quite a wicked ritual that was played out to show us that indeed it was occulted men intentionally behind such an act that in reality was meant to be nothing more than how to begin and end calendars. We'll end things there as you meditate on the real reasons why many of these events are scripted out in advance, why many of these holy days or holidays are actually celebrated, and how important it really is to make yourself available to this real wisdom, this real knowledge, this real reality that has been occulted and held in so many layered ways above all of our heads. This is why we're doing this work and why it's so important, so that we can see all the way through this deception and make ourselves better in the process for no longer being so easily deceived. Until next time, be well.